Just 24 hours out from what's being called a game-changing announcement by Donald Trump, and the rumor mill is in overdrive. Pundits, politicians, and online channels are sounding alarms about a major escalation in the Russia-Ukraine war and the role the United States and NATO could play. Claims are flying that Trump, freed from election pressures, will go further than Biden ever dared, arming Ukraine at record levels, unleashing sweeping new sanctions, and, if you believe the most feverish reports, setting the stage for NATO missiles to rain down on Moscow. It's dramatic. It's headline-grabbing. But is it real? Or is it another round of high-stakes posturing, built more for the campaign trail and clickbait than for the battlefield? That's what we're unpacking tonight. Let's cut through the noise and go to the sources. Right now, there is no official statement from Trump's team or from the Pentagon about imminent, unprecedented weapons shipments to Ukraine. The closest we have are recent comments from Senator Lindsey Graham and a handful of hawkish lawmakers calling for more and faster aid. But rhetoric and reality are not the same. Weapons shipments, whether long-range missiles, advanced air defense, or heavy armor, require months of logistics, coordination with European allies, and, in the U.S., approval from Congress. Even when support is high, as it has been for defensive weapons and ammunition, there are political and logistical breaks. The idea of massive record-setting deliveries or a sudden unilateral surge is just not in the cards. Germany, for example, is under intense pressure to deliver Taurus long-range missiles, but Chancellor Scholz remains cautious, and the German Bundestag has made clear that such a step would only come after months of debate and international coordination. France and the UK are increasing their own support, but the triple-digit missile deliveries rumored in some circles remain just that, rumors. It's a story designed to grab attention, not a reflection of decisions made in Berlin, Paris, or Washington. Let's talk about what it actually takes for a modern weapons system to reach Ukraine's front lines. First, every delivery begins with a decision, one that's rarely made in a single day or with a single leader's approval. In Washington, even the fastest aid packages get debated, scrutinized, amended, and delayed by committee votes, public statements, budget negotiations, and political posturing. The process doesn't speed up just because the need is urgent. Once something is authorized, the logistical reality kicks in. Picture the journey. A shipment of long-range missiles or advanced air defense batteries doesn't travel in the open. It gets broken up, disguised, routed through multiple staging points, sometimes across several NATO borders, before it ever gets close to Ukrainian soil. Military transport aircraft are coordinated with local authorities, train schedules adjusted to avoid detection, and, along the way, supply chains are stretched thin by the simple reality of geography and risk. Now add another layer, training. Many Western weapons systems, especially the newest anti-air or anti-missile platforms, can't just be handed off. Ukrainian crews have to be brought to secret or semi-secret bases across Europe, sometimes in Germany, sometimes in Poland, sometimes even in the UK, where they spend weeks learning the nuances of new hardware, software, and battle doctrine. Only once they've passed basic proficiency can these units be deployed back to the front, and even then, integration takes time. The recent Patriot missile deployments are a perfect example. Announced with fanfare, approved in a hurry, but the first Ukrainian teams didn't become fully operational for months, and even now, additional rounds of training and adaptation continue. Meanwhile, politics never stops. Every significant shipment is debated not just in Congress or Parliament, but in the news media, on social media, and at the highest diplomatic tables. Allies must balance support for Ukraine with domestic pressure, from voters who worry about escalation, from industrial lobbies that worry about running out of equipment for their own militaries, and from intelligence agencies that track every possible Russian countermove. The Taurus missile case in Germany is telling. Berlin faces relentless lobbying from Kiev and Washington, but also strong public skepticism and memories of past military overreach. Each missile package becomes a miniature diplomatic drama, with leaders weighing not just the needs of Ukraine, but the risk of provoking Moscow, the stability of their own coalition governments, and the reaction of neighboring EU states. Even after a deal is reached, The final mile is never simple. Routes change at the last minute to avoid leaks, convoys may move at night under heavy security, and the risk of sabotage or targeted strikes is always present. In practice, what the public sees as a shipment is really the end of a marathon and the start of another. A single political speech can make it sound like change is instant, but in reality, the distance between a press conference and the battlefield is measured in months and miles, and in the quiet coordination of dozens of actors, each with their own priorities and fears. This is why, despite the noise, record-setting deliveries aren't just a matter of political will, but of constant, painstaking work that's mostly invisible to the headlines. As for sanctions, the headlines about 500% tariffs on Russian oil and massive penalties for countries like India, China, and Brazil? Again, the facts tell a different story. The Biden administration has pushed for tougher enforcement of the oil price cap, and there is bipartisan appetite in Congress for making sanctions harder to evade. But no one is moving forward with the kind of all-out economic war that would target not just Russia, but any country doing business with them, at least not without massive diplomatic fallout and likely global economic shockwaves. The talk about punishing India and China for buying Russian oil is political theater, not official US or NATO policy. Even when the rhetoric heats up, the policy is much slower, cautious, and shaped by the realities of the global energy market. So where does all this leave Ukraine? The past month has seen a real increase in drone and missile attacks, both inbound on Ukrainian cities and outbound on Russian territory, including high-profile strikes on oil refineries and logistics hubs near the Russian border. These attacks are significant and in some cases unprecedented in scale, but they don't represent a fundamental shift in the rules of the war. Russia continues its own barrages against Kharkiv, Odessa, and Mykolaiv, targeting civilian and military infrastructure alike. Ukrainian forces, meanwhile, have adapted with creative drone swarms, new air defense systems, and a network of partisans and special units operating behind enemy lines. The escalation is real, but it's a slow boil, not a sudden leap. What about the claims that NATO is on the verge of letting Ukraine strike Moscow with Western missiles? There's no public evidence that the US or any NATO member is giving Ukraine the green light to launch deep strikes into the Russian capital with American or European weapons. Yes, there is growing debate in Washington and Brussels about loosening restrictions, allowing Ukraine to target military facilities inside Russia that are used to launch attacks on Ukrainian cities. Some analysts say this could act as a deterrent, while others warn it risks widening the war and could provoke a disproportionate response from Moscow, including possible escalation to new classes of weaponry. But the idea of a free-for-all, with NATO-supplied missiles raining on Russian soil, is a media narrative, not policy. Military doctrine, both US and European, remains careful, balancing support for Ukraine with clear red lines meant to avoid direct confrontation with Russia. Let's talk about escalation. Every serious military observer will tell you escalation is a ladder, not a switch. Supplying Ukraine with more advanced weapons changes the battlefield, but every new step, long-range artillery, precision drones, next-gen air defense, comes with new risks. Russia has repeatedly warned that it sees deep strikes on its territory as red lines and has responded in the past with missile barrages and threats of even more destructive retaliation. The risk is not just in Moscow's rhetoric. There's a credible concern echoed by US and European military planners that if Russia feels it is losing ground, especially near its own borders or in Crimea, it could resort to new types of weapons, whether high-yield conventional bombs, cyber sabotage, or in the worst-case scenario, tactical nuclear devices intended for battlefield use. That's not a certainty, but it's a risk that cannot be dismissed. But let's ground this in what's actually happening. Right now, both sides are testing limits, but they are doing so carefully, with one eye always on the broader consequences. Ukraine is pressing its advantage with Western technology, but still calibrating its strikes to avoid crossing NATO-imposed lines. Russia is ramping up missile production, employing decoys and electronic warfare to try and disrupt Ukrainian air defenses. but it hasn't unleashed anything that fundamentally changes the nature of the conflict. The balance is delicate, and both sides understand that one miscalculation could bring Europe, and potentially the world, into a much wider war. At the same time, geopolitical attention is being pulled in multiple directions. Tensions between Israel and Iran continue to rise, with both sides engaged in covert operations and proxy conflicts across the Middle East. Recent weeks have seen a series of strikes and counterstrikes, cyber attacks, drone raids, missile exchanges that have put the entire region on edge. The U.S. remains committed to supporting Israel's security, but is wary of getting drawn into a direct conflict that could spiral into a broader regional war. In the background, China and North Korea are increasing military activity in the Pacific, conducting joint drills and issuing warnings about Western provocations. The world is entering a phase where multiple theaters, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific, are heating up at once, stretching diplomatic and military bandwidth thin. There's also the economic front. Sanctions on Russia, Iran, and China are having real effects, but the idea that the West is on the verge of imposing a true global embargo, one that would force major economies like India and Brazil to choose sides, is overblown. Yes, there are incremental moves to tighten enforcement, and some in Congress and the EU would like to see more aggressive measures. But the reality is that a sudden, all-out economic war would risk massive blowback, including to American and European economies already under strain from inflation and supply chain disruptions. Policymakers know this, and that's why real changes happen in steps, not seismic shocks. Now let's address the elephant in the room. How much of this escalation talk is driven by actual events, and how much is driven by the U.S. political calendar? With Trump and Biden both in campaign mode, every move gets amplified, every statement gets spun, and every rumor gets a life of its own. There's a strategic advantage for candidates to appear tough on Russia, or strong on national defense, and the news cycle is eager to turn speculation into certainty. But as any seasoned observer knows, what's said on the stump often bears little resemblance to what happens in the Situation Room. The narrative of 24 hours to the tipping point is powerful, but it's also a tool, a way to shape public opinion, pressure allies, and send signals to adversaries. It's not always a preview of what's coming next. So what should we really be watching? First, the pace and scale of actual weapons deliveries, what's moving, what's being promised, and what's still just talk. Second, the real response from Moscow, not just in words, but in force posture, deployments, and the use of new tactics or technology. Third, how allied governments, especially in Europe, react to pressure from Washington and from their own electorates. Fourth, developments in the Middle East and the Pacific, where local conflicts have global implications. And finally, the resilience of global markets. Energy prices, supply chains, and investor confidence are the real barometers of how close we are to an escalation that can't be walked back. Here's the key reflection. In moments like this, the greatest risk is often not a deliberate decision to go to war, but a miscalculation, an unintended escalation that spins out of control because each side is trying to prove its resolve. History is full of examples where rhetoric and posturing pushed adversaries closer to the edge than anyone intended. That's why understanding the real dynamics and separating hype from fact is more important than ever. Let's pull back for a final perspective. The world is not at the edge of guaranteed war, but it is entering a phase of heightened volatility. Technology, alliance politics, and the speed of information have made crises more interconnected than ever before. As the US and Europe debate how far to go in arming Ukraine, and as Russia calibrates its responses, every signal and every misstep carries outsized weight. The days ahead will see more rumors, more announcements, and more claims of imminent escalation. Some will be true, many will be theater. Your best defense is clarity, knowing the difference between noise and movement. If you've made it this far, you're not just scrolling for drama, You want to see past the headlines and understand what's really at stake. Subscribe to Safety Zone and stay with us as we track the facts, challenge the hype, and bring you the updates that matter most so you can prepare, reflect, and make sense of a world that rarely stands still.